The gun pressed cold and hard against Louisa Sullivan's temple, and the man holding it was not a stranger. He was Chester Beaumont, the most respected cattle broker in Redemption Creek, Texas, the man who had shaken her father's hand 1,000 times, who had sat at their Sunday dinner table, who had smiled at her with teeth too white and eyes too empty. And now he had her by the arm in the shadow of the livery stable, with the whole town of Redemption Creek less than 50 yards away, going about its business as though Louisa Sullivan did not exist. Which, she supposed, was exactly what everyone in this town had always done. "Tell me where your father keeps the deed," Chester Beaumont said, his voice as calm as a man ordering coffee. "Tell me and I walk away. You never saw me. We forget this whole ugly business." Louisa's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Her hands were shaking, but she pressed her lips together and said nothing, because she knew something Chester Beaumont did not know. She knew that someone had seen them. She had caught the flash of a star-shaped badge out of the corner of her eye, the glint of it in the afternoon sun, and she had recognized the lean, deliberate silhouette of a man she had known for exactly 3 weeks, a man who was new to this town and therefore had not yet learned the most important rule of Redemption Creek, that Louisa Sullivan was invisible, overlooked, irrelevant, and not worth noticing. Ezekiel Hawkins had not learned that rule. And right now, moving quiet as smoke along the far wall of the livery stable with his hand resting on the grip of his Colt single-action army revolver, he was proving it. "Last chance," Beaumont said, pressing the gun harder. "The deed." Louisa drew a slow breath and looked Chester Beaumont dead in his cold, empty eyes and said, "You are going to regret this." Beaumont laughed, short and ugly. "Is that so? And who exactly is going to make me regret it? Your father, who can barely walk, the hands who have already jumped to my payroll, the sheriff who I own like a horse." The shadow behind Beaumont moved. "How about me?" said Ezekiel Hawkins, and the click of a hammer being drawn back was the loudest sound Louisa Sullivan had ever heard in her life. Everything that followed happened in the space of a heartbeat. Beaumont spun. Ezekiel caught the man's gun arm with one hand, wrenched it sideways with a move that was fast and practiced and looked almost effortless, and the pistol fell into the dirt. Louisa stepped back, breathing hard, watching as Ezekiel pinned Chester Beaumont against the stable wall with a forearm across his chest and a revolver leveled at his chin. "Chester Beaumont," Ezekiel said, still in that quiet voice that somehow carried more weight than a shout, "you are under arrest." And in that moment, standing in the shadow of the livery stable with her heart still slamming and her knees threatening to give out, Louisa Sullivan understood that the way this moment had arrived was far more complicated than it looked. Because nothing about the past 3 weeks had been simple. Nothing about Ezekiel Hawkins had been simple. And the story of how they had reached this terrible, pivotal, breathless moment had begun, as so many stories do, with something small. It had begun with a horse. Redemption Creek sat in the rolling hill country of central Texas in the year 1882, a town that had grown up fast around water and cattle and stubborn human will. It had a main street of packed dirt that turned to rust-colored mud in the rain, a general store, a post office, a barber who also pulled teeth, 2 saloons, a church built from cedar planks, and a jailhouse that smelled of old iron and tobacco. It had a sheriff named Amos Pratt who was 62 years old and had held his post for 19 years because no one had bothered to challenge him. It had several hundred citizens, most of whom knew each other by name and reputation, and most of whom had made their peace with the social order as it stood. At the top of that social order, quietly and without much fanfare, sat the cattle ranchers. And the biggest rancher in the county, the man with the most land and the most head of cattle and the most hands on his payroll, was Patrick Sullivan. Patrick Sullivan had been a hard man in his prime. He had come to Texas from County Cork, Ireland, by way of New Orleans, and he had built the Sullivan Ranch from raw scrubland through sheer stubbornness and an absolute refusal to quit. He had a son named Brendan who had died of fever at age 12. He had a wife named Margaret who had died in childbirth at age 34. And he had a daughter named Louisa, who was 23 years old and had somehow, without anyone quite deciding to do it, become invisible. It was not that people were cruel to Louisa. It was something more insidious than cruelty. It was that they simply did not see her. She was not beautiful in any dramatic way, though she was something better than plain, with dark auburn hair and gray eyes and a way of holding herself very still when she was thinking. She was not loud. She did not demand attention. She ran the household accounts, ordered supplies, managed the kitchen, and helped with the books because her father's hands had been suffering from the joints for 2 years. She did the work of someone essential and received the notice of someone decorative. The hands called her Miss Sullivan with a respectful tip of the hat and then forgot she was there. The women of the town were polite and distant, more interested in the wives of the ranchers, which Louisa was not. The young men who came courting came once, met her father, got distracted by the talk of cattle and land prices, and did not come back. The merchants in town served her efficiently. The pastor knew her name and forgot her face. Even the people who depended on her, the cook, the housekeeper, the bookkeeper her father occasionally employed, treated her like a piece of well-made furniture. Present, functional, invisible, Louisa had made her peace with it. That was what she told herself. She had made her peace. And then in the 3rd week of April, a horse arrived in Redemption Creek carrying a man she had never seen before. She was at the general store, picking up a bolt of muslin and a bag of cornmeal and a letter her father had received from a land office in Austin, when the horse came down Main Street at a walk. It was a big bay gelding, well kept but trail dusty, and the man on it sat like someone who had been born in the saddle. He was tall, with dark brown skin and broad shoulders under a trail coat that was the color of old tobacco, and he wore a star pin to his vest that caught the afternoon light. Deputy U.S. Marshal. The words on the badge were small, but she could read them. He pulled up outside the sheriff's office, swung down with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and led his horse to the rail. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard, and a revolver on his hip, and a look about him like he had seen most of what the world had to offer, and had formed his own private opinions about all of it. Louisa watched him from the doorway of the general store, and then she made herself stop watching and went back to her business, because Redemption Creek was not a town that looked kindly on a black man wearing a federal badge, and she had learned long ago that other people's troubles were not hers to solve. She found out his name from Mrs. Aldrich at the dry goods counter. "Ezekiel Hawkins," Mrs. Aldrich said, in the tone she used for all information she considered significant. "Sent from Austin. Some arrangement with Sheriff Pratt about jurisdiction on the cattle theft cases. He is apparently going to be posted here for some months." "Is that so?" Louisa said. "Some people are not pleased," Mrs. Aldrich added, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions but was wise enough about commerce to keep them to herself. Louisa paid for her supplies, loaded them into the wagon, and drove home. She thought about it that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the account books open in front of her and the lamp burning low. A federal deputy in Redemption Creek. A man sent specifically to investigate the cattle theft that had been bleeding the ranches in the county for the better part of a year, including the Sullivan Ranch. 3 times in the past year, cattle had gone missing from their property. Her father, who was proud in the way that men from his generation were proud, had filed reports with Sheriff Pratt and received in return nothing but sympathetic nods and slow-moving paperwork. Someone was stealing from them. Someone was stealing from all the ranches, and so far no one had been able or willing to find out who. Louisa added up the column of numbers in the account book for the 3rd time and got the same depressing answer. They were not broke, not yet. But they were close enough to the edge that she had stopped sleeping well at night. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and did not think about Ezekiel Hawkins again for 4 days. The next time she saw him, it was accidental, and it was the horse that caused it. She had ridden out alone to check on the eastern fence line, which one of the hands had reported as being down in 2 places. She rode a chestnut mare named Clara, who was steady and reliable and exactly the kind of horse Louisa preferred. She found the downed fence, noted the locations, turned back toward home, and was halfway across the ridge when Clara stepped badly on a loose stone and came up lame. Louisa dismounted, checked the leg, and determined it was not broken, just a tender hoof that needed time. She could walk Clara home from here, but it was 4 miles and the afternoon was getting long. She stood in the open country with the spring wind coming off the hills and the faint smell of cedar in the air, considering her options when she heard hooves. The bay gelding came over the ridge at a trot, and the man on it pulled up when he saw her, just as anyone in the country would have done. He swung down without ceremony. "Trouble?" he asked. "Lame horse," she said. He crouched down and looked at Clara's hoof with the quiet attention of a man who knew horses, ran his thumb along the frog, pressed gently in 2 places, and stood up. "Stone bruise. She will be fine in a few days with rest. You need a ride back." It was a practical question, and she gave it a practical answer. "I would appreciate it. I am Louisa Sullivan. My father's ranch is about 4 miles northwest." "Ezekiel Hawkins," he said. "I know who your father is. I have been meaning to speak with him about the cattle losses." "He would be glad of it," she said, and then, because she had been raised to be honest, "he would be gladder than he shows. He is proud." Ezekiel looked at her then, a steady, direct look that she was not used to receiving. Most people's eyes moved past her the way eyes moved past a fence post, registering her presence and then continuing on to whatever was more interesting. His did not. "And you," he said, "are you glad of it?" "I manage the accounts," she said. "So yes." "Quite glad." He helped her onto his horse, led Clara behind on the rein, and they went back across the ridge together. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. She had always found that you could tell a great deal about a person from the quality of their silence, and his was easy. He did not fill it with chatter, did not explain himself, did not say anything just to avoid the quiet. He walked alongside his own horse at an easy pace and let the land be what it was. When they reached the edge of the Sullivan property, he spoke again. "How long has the trouble been going on?" "A year, give or take. First loss was last June. 3 dozen head from the north pasture, gone overnight with no track worth following. Sheriff Pratt came out, looked around, wrote a report, and that was the end of it. And since, 2 more incidents, smaller, but we are not a small operation, and 3 losses in a year add up." He nodded slowly. He was watching the land around them the way a man watches when he is reading it, looking for things other people do not see. "You file with the county or with the circuit court?" "Both," she said. "I wrote the second letter myself when my father's hands were too bad." He glanced up at her. "You handle most of the business correspondence." "I handle all of it," she said. "My father sets the direction and makes the decisions. I make sure the paper follows." There was something in his expression that she could not quite name. It was not pity and it was not condescension. It was something closer to recognition. "What else do you know about the other ranches?" he said. "Specifically, who has filed losses and who has not?" she told him. She had been keeping track. In the private way, she kept track of everything, because information was useful and useful things should be recorded. She told him which ranches had filed reports, which had not, what the pattern of the losses looked like when you laid them end to end. She had 3 months of mental notes on the subject, and she gave them all to him in the time it took to cross the last pasture to the house. When they reached the yard, he helped her down from the horse and then stood looking at her with that same direct attention. "That," he said, "was more useful information than I have gotten from Sheriff Pratt in 3 days." "Sheriff Pratt does not look for patterns," she said. "No," Ezekiel agreed. "He does not." He met her father that afternoon, and Patrick Sullivan received him with the wary courtesy of a man who was grateful but could not quite show it. They sat on the porch and talked cattle for an hour while Louisa brought coffee and then stayed, because no one thought to tell her to leave, and she was careful not to draw attention to the fact that she was listening to every word. The picture that emerged from that conversation, combined with what Louisa had already known, was beginning to look like something with a shape. The losses always happened on nights when the hands were thin on the ground. The cattle were never found. There was no word of cheap beef showing up in the nearby markets. Someone was moving significant numbers of animals somewhere, with organization and money and connections. After Ezekiel left, her father looked at her over his coffee cup. "He will do," Patrick Sullivan said, which was high praise from a man who trusted almost no one. Louisa said nothing. She cleared the coffee cups and did the dishes and thought about the way Ezekiel Hawkins had looked at her when she spoke, like he was actually listening, like what she said was worth the effort of hearing. It was a disconcerting feeling. She was not sure she liked it. Or rather, she was not sure she trusted it, which was a different problem entirely. Over the following 2 weeks, Ezekiel Hawkins made himself a fixture in Redemption Creek in the quiet way that competent men make themselves fixtures anywhere. He talked to people. He rode the county roads. He stopped by the jailhouse to work with Sheriff Pratt, though it became increasingly clear to Louisa, who paid attention to these things, that the relationship between the two men was polite and thin as paper. Pratt was cooperative on the surface and obstructive just underneath, the way a man acts when he has something to hide but has not yet decided whether to run or bluff. She saw Ezekiel twice more in those first 2 weeks, both times briefly. Once at the general store, where he tipped his hat and asked if she had remembered any more patterns about the losses, and she told him about the moon cycles, which she had noticed purely by accident while cross-referencing the dates. The losses all happened within 3 days of a new moon. Dark nights. He went very still when she said that and wrote it in his notebook and looked at her with something she was starting to identify as respect. Once at the church social, where she was helping serve lemonade, and he arrived at the edge of the gathering with the careful posture of a man who knows he is not entirely welcome, but is too self-possessed to let it bother him. Several of the ranchers' wives made a point of turning away. 2 of the men he had come specifically to speak to found other places to be. Louisa watched this happen from her position behind the lemonade table and felt something tighten in her chest that she recognized, because she had felt it on her own behalf 1,000 times. The specific pain of being looked through. She picked up a glass of lemonade and walked across the churchyard to where he was standing and handed it to him. He took it with a slight, genuine smile. "Thank you. The Hargrove brothers are at the far end of the yard," she said, in a voice meant only for him. "They lost cattle last September and would not file a report. I do not know why, but if you approach them casually, they might talk." He looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" It was a direct question, and she gave it a direct answer. "Because someone is stealing from my father, and you are the only person I have met in the past year who seems genuinely interested in finding out who." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once slowly. "I will remember that," he said. She went back to her lemonade table, and if anyone noticed the exchange, they gave no sign of it. But then, they rarely noticed anything she did. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and the account books open, and thought about the way he had asked why she was helping him. Not with suspicion, with genuine curiosity, like her answer mattered, like her reasons were worth understanding. She added up the columns in the account book and tried to identify exactly what it was about Ezekiel Hawkins that made her feel slightly different than she felt around other people. She arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. He made her feel present. He made her feel like she was actually in the room. She was not sure what to do with that. The 3rd week brought a change in the weather and a change in the situation. The spring rains came down hard for 4 days, turning the roads to mud and the creek to a brown rushing torrent, and Redemption Creek became briefly the kind of town that goes quiet under rain, everyone inside, everyone waiting. On the 5th day, Ezekiel Hawkins appeared at the Sullivan Ranch in the early morning with his hat brim dripping and a look on his face that was very controlled but had something urgent underneath it. She answered the door herself, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Hooper, was at the back of the house and her father was still at breakfast. "I need to speak with your father," he said, but I also need to speak with you." She looked at him for a moment, reading the urgency that he was holding tightly in check. "Come in," she said. He came in and took off his hat and stood in the entrance hall while she went to get her father, and when she came back with Patrick Sullivan leaning on his cane and looking curious and alert, Ezekiel laid out what he had found. In 4 days of riding in the rain, visiting properties and talking to hands, and following the thread of information she had given him, Ezekiel had built a picture that was not yet complete but was becoming recognizable. The cattle were being moved at night, on dark moon nights, through a series of smaller properties that formed a rough corridor heading south toward the border. Someone was coordinating it, someone with the resources to pay the owners of those smaller properties to look the other way, to hire enough hands to move cattle quickly, and to have buyers waiting in Mexico. That kind of operation required money, planning, and most critically, it required knowledge of the ranches. Knowledge of the herds, the fence lines, the patrol schedules. "Someone close," Patrick Sullivan said, his voice flat and hard. "Someone who knows the territory well," Ezekiel said. "Someone with connections both here and further south." A silence settled in the room. Louisa had been standing near the window, quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet, the way that made people forget she was there. She said, "Chester Beaumont." Both men looked at her. She felt a flicker of the old instinct, the one that said be smaller, say less, do not put yourself forward. She pressed past it. "He is the biggest cattle broker in the county. He knows every ranch and every herd. He has a buyer's network that runs into Mexico. He has the money. And every time I have looked at the account books, the losses have been in the weeks following his ranch visits, when he would have been able to see exactly what was in each pasture and how many hands were on." Silence. "I should have said this before," she added. "I was not certain enough. I am not certain now, but it fits." Ezekiel was looking at her with the kind of attention that felt like being actually seen, which was still an unfamiliar sensation. "What else?" he said. "Is there anything else about Beaumont that caught your attention?" "He offered to buy my father's ranch last September, right after the first cattle loss. The offer was below market value, as though he expected us to be desperate." Patrick Sullivan's face had gone very still. "He offered me a fair price," he said slowly. "He offered you below fair," Louisa said, as gently as she could manage. "I looked it up. Austin land values, adjusted for the water rights and the herd size we had before the losses. He offered you 60 cents on the dollar." Her father looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through his face. It was not anger. It was the expression of a man realizing that something had been in front of him the whole time and he had not seen it, and the person who had seen it was standing 3 feet away and had been seeing it quietly, without complaint, for months. "Well," Patrick Sullivan said very quietly. "Hell," Ezekiel said, "I cannot move on Beaumont without evidence. Not yet. What I need is a way to catch the operation in the act, and for that I need to know when the next move will be." "Next new moon is in 11 days, Louisa said. Both men looked at her again. "I looked at the calendar," she said simply. Ezekiel made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and warm. 11 days, he said. "That gives us time." He stayed for another hour talking strategy with her father, and Louisa made more coffee and stayed in the room and contributed when she had something to contribute and was quiet when she did not. When Ezekiel left, he paused at the door and looked directly at her. "Those observations about Beaumont," he said, "you should write them down. Every detail, dates, amounts, everything you remember. It may be useful." "I already have," she said. He looked at her for a moment that went a beat longer than necessary. "Of course you have," he said, and there was warmth in it, genuine and unguarded, and it landed somewhere in her chest like a coal from a fire. After he left, she stood in the entrance hall for a moment with her hand on the door frame and tried to identify exactly what she was feeling. It was not something she was accustomed to. It was something bright and slightly alarming, like the feeling just before lightning strikes when the air goes sharp and everything becomes very clear. She went to the kitchen, sat at the table, and opened the account books, but she did not see the numbers for quite some time. The 11 days were not idle ones. Ezekiel came to the ranch twice more in that time, both times with specific questions, and a focus that she found steadying rather than intrusive. He was the kind of man who did not waste motion. When he sat at the kitchen table with her father and a cup of coffee and his notebook, he listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke it was always to the point. The second time he came, her father was resting after a bad afternoon with the joint pain, and the housekeeper had gone to town, and Louisa found herself alone at the kitchen table with Ezekiel Hawkins and a pot of coffee and the notes she had written, and no particular reason to hurry. He looked through her notes for a long time, reading carefully. She watched his face while he read, the slight shift of attention behind his eyes as he reached something significant, the occasional small nod. He had a face that gave away less than most people's, but she was beginning to learn it. A month ago she would have said it was an unreadable face. Now she was starting to understand that it was not unreadable. It was simply honest, and honest faces did not need to perform. "You are thorough," he said, setting the notes down. "I had time," she said. He looked up. "What does that mean?" She considered how to answer. She was not, by nature, a woman who shared easily. She had learned to be self-contained because no one had ever made it feel safe to be otherwise. But there was something in the way he asked, straight and without agenda, that made the honest answer easy. "Means that I do not go to many social events," she said. "I do not have many friends. I am not in this town someone who is sought out, so I have a great deal of time to read and to think and to pay attention to things that other people are too busy being sought out to notice." He was quiet for a moment. "Redemption Creek's loss," he said. "Is that sympathy?" "No," he said. "It is an observation. Sympathy would be useless to you. You are not a person who needs sympathy." She looked at him. "What kind of person am I?" It came out more directly than she intended, and she almost pulled it back, but he answered before she could. "Capable," he said, "patient, very observant, and probably angrier than you let on." The accuracy of it startled a small laugh out of her. "That is quite specific." "You told me you manage all the business correspondence," he said. "You have been tracking the cattle losses on your own initiative for a year. You noticed a detail about moon cycles that everyone else missed. You figured out Beaumont before I did, which I will admit is only slightly galling." The corner of his mouth lifted. "And you handed me a glass of lemonade at a church social in front of a town that was not sure they wanted me there, without making a performance of it. That is the action of someone who has strong opinions and knows how to keep them." She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "I have been invisible for most of my adult life," she said. "I became angry about it a long time ago, and then I became tired of being angry, and then I became useful." "You are more than useful," he said. It was quiet and direct and not a compliment in the flattering sense. It was a statement of fact, the way he would state any other fact, and it landed harder than any flattery would have. She looked up at him. He was watching her with those steady dark eyes, and the kitchen was very quiet around them, and the late afternoon light came through the window at an angle that turned everything amber and soft. Something shifted very slightly in the air between them. She stood up and poured more coffee. "You were in the marshal service before you came here?" she asked. 3 years, he said. "Before that I was in the cavalry. Before that I did not have many options that did not involve someone else deciding what I was worth." She heard what was underneath that, the same shape of injustice she recognized from her own different experience. "The cavalry," she said. "Buffalo soldiers." He nodded. "Ninth Cavalry out of Fort Concho. 4 years. Why did you leave?" "I decided I wanted to enforce the law rather than fight on behalf of people who were uncomfortable with my presence." He paused. "The marshal service is not entirely different, but it is somewhat different, and it pays better." She smiled. "Practical." "Always," he said, and he smiled back, and it was the first time she had seen a full, unguarded smile from him, and it changed the whole landscape of his face, and she had to look at the window for a moment to gather herself. She was falling in love with him. The recognition arrived without any gentleness whatsoever, the way the truth usually does. It did not ask her permission. It did not arrive gradually with warning signs and chances to retreat. It simply was, sitting in the middle of her chest like a stone placed there by someone who knew exactly where it would do the most damage. She was falling in love with a man who was passing through. A federal deputy on an assignment, who would go back to Austin, or wherever the Marshal Service sent him next when this was over. A man who had treated her with more genuine attention in 3 weeks than anyone in this town had shown her in years, which made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with guns. She drank her coffee and talked about the surveillance plan for the new moon night and did not say any of this, because she was a practical woman and she knew the difference between what she felt and what was wise to reveal. She knew it. She was nearly certain of it. She did not act on it. Yet, the days before the new moon passed with the specific tension of waiting. Ezekiel spent most of his time riding the county roads and the surrounding territory, and Louisa spent most of hers running the household and managing the books and writing in the private journal she kept about the case, which was growing thick with observations and cross-referenced dates. 4 days before the new moon, her father called her into his study. He was sitting at his desk, his hands flat on the blotter, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who is about to say something difficult. "Chester Beaumont came to see me this afternoon," Patrick Sullivan said. Louisa went very still. "While I was in town." "While you were in town, he brought his lawyers. He has bought the water rights to the North Creek. I do not know how, I signed nothing, but he has papers." She sat down. "That is not possible. The papers look genuine." He looked at her. "Louisa, if he controls the water rights to the North Creek, he controls this ranch. He cannot run cattle without water access." "Those papers are forgeries," she said, "or fraud. He obtained them through someone in the county office." "I know." He looked older suddenly, older and very tired, which means he has people inside the county system, which means he is not just a thief. He has been planning something larger. She thought of Ezekiel and felt a fierce surge of something that was partly desperation and partly fury. "I need to get this to Deputy Hawkins." "Yes," her father said. "You do, and Louisa," he paused, "when you go, take the gun." She went. She took the gun, a small Remington Derringer that had belonged to her mother and that she had been shooting since she was 16, and she rode to town in the late afternoon. She found Ezekiel at the jailhouse, where he was sitting at the extra desk that Sheriff Pratt had grudgingly assigned to him, writing reports. She told him everything. He listened without interruption, and she watched the controlled urgency take hold in him, the way a man looks when several threads he has been pulling suddenly pull toward the same point. "The water rights fraud means he has someone inside the county land office," he said, "which changes the shape of what I am dealing with. He is trying to force the sale of the ranch before we can expose him," Louisa said. "If he owns the water rights, he can make the property worthless and then buy it at nothing. He is accelerating, which means he knows the investigation is getting close." Ezekiel was on his feet now, pacing in the small way of a man thinking on his feet. "We cannot wait for the new moon. I need to move faster." "What do you need?" He stopped pacing and looked at her. "I need those account books. The ones with the dates of his ranch, visits cross-referenced with the losses. That is evidence I can take to the circuit judge, along with the water rights fraud. If I can get the circuit judge to sign a warrant, I can arrest Beaumont without going through Pratt." "I will bring them tomorrow morning," she said. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in it that was more than the courtesy of the words, something that made her want to stand very still and not break it. She turned to go. "Miss Sullivan," he said. She turned back. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense of a man choosing his words carefully, not because he was unsure of them, but because they mattered. "Be careful going home," he said. "If Beaumont is moving faster than expected, we should both assume he is watching." "I am always careful," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you are." She rode home in the golden hour of the late afternoon, thinking about everything and trying not to think about one thing in particular. She was still thinking about it when she unsaddled her horse and walked across the yard and heard something that sounded wrong, a footstep where no footstep should be, in the shadow of the barn. She put her hand on the Derringer in her pocket, but it was not from the barn that the threat came. It was from the livery stable in town, the next morning, when she had gone to collect a harness the blacksmith had repaired, and Chester Beaumont stepped out of the shadow with a pistol and a smile that did not reach his eyes. And that was how they had arrived at this moment. The gun against her temple, the cold wall of the stable, the town going about its business just far enough away, and Ezekiel Hawkins coming through the shadows like justice on quiet feet. Now, with Chester Beaumont pinned against the stable wall and his pistol in the dirt and Ezekiel's revolver leveled at his chin, Louisa pressed her back against the far wall and breathed and tried to get her hands to stop shaking. "Chester Beaumont," Ezekiel said in the voice that was quiet and absolute, "you are under arrest on charges including theft of livestock, wire fraud, forging land records, and assault." "You have no authority here," Beaumont said. He was afraid, but he was also calculating, which made him more dangerous than a man who was simply afraid. "This is county jurisdiction. You are a federal officer. Cattle theft that crosses county lines is federal jurisdiction," Ezekiel said. "And you have been crossing lines all the way to the Mexican border." He kept the revolver steady and his eyes on Beaumont and did not look at Louisa, which she understood was tactical but which still took effort to bear. "Walk." Beaumont was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You cannot make this stick. I have people in the county office. I have the sheriff." "You had the sheriff," Ezekiel said. "Sheriff Pratt was arrested this morning by 2 U.S. Marshals who arrived from Austin on the early stage. I sent for them 4 days ago." Louisa felt something unlock in her chest, wide and sudden as a gate swinging open. Beaumont went very still. The calculation in his eyes shifted into something uglier, and for a moment she was genuinely afraid he was going to try something reckless. But Ezekiel was watching him with a steadiness that left no room for recklessness, and after a long breath, Chester Beaumont's shoulders dropped and he said nothing. "Walk," Ezekiel said again, and this time Beaumont walked. Louisa followed them out of the shadow of the stable and into the afternoon sun of Redemption Creek's Main Street. And if anyone noticed the sight of Chester Beaumont being walked at gunpoint to the jailhouse by the federal deputy, they noticed it in the loud way of people who suddenly see something they cannot unsee, the murmur rising up through the street like water coming to a boil. She stood in the middle of the street and watched Ezekiel take Beaumont into the jailhouse, and she thought about all the things she had not said, and all the things she still needed to say, and whether this was the right time for any of them. It was probably not, but she waited anyway. The 2 marshals from Austin, a pair of solid, quiet men named Garrett and Fisk, were already in the jailhouse when Ezekiel brought Beaumont in. Louisa watched from the open door as they took charge of the prisoner and began the formal process of arrest and charge, and Ezekiel came back out onto the street, and he looked at her. He looked tired. Not the shallow tiredness of a bad night's sleep, but the deeper tiredness of a man who has been running very hard on very high stakes and has just, with considerable precision, landed exactly where he needed to be. His hat was pushed back on his head and his coat was dusty, and there was something about him standing there in the afternoon sun in the middle of Redemption Creek's Main Street that was more real to her than anything she had ever looked at. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I will be." He looked at her for a moment. "Come inside. I need your account books for the marshals." She went inside, and she gave the marshals her account books and her written observations and the dates and the cross-referenced losses and everything else she had documented, and they received it with the careful attention of men who understood evidence. And she felt something that she recognized after a moment as the specific satisfaction of having been useful in a way that counted. When it was over and the marshals had what they needed and Beaumont was in a locked cell and the sun was going down outside, Ezekiel walked her out to where Clara was tied at the rail, her hoof apparently recovered enough for a slow ride. The street was quiet. The town had absorbed the events of the afternoon and retreated inside to talk about them, the way small towns do. The evening air was warm and smelled of cedar and horses, and the particular dusty sweetness of Texas in the spring. Louisa untied Clara and stood with the reins in her hands and the golden light falling across the street and said, "What happens now?" "The circuit judge comes in from Waco on Friday," Ezekiel said. "The case against Beaumont is solid. The water rights fraud alone will finish him, and the cattle theft evidence goes back far enough to put him away for years. The people in the county land office who took his money will be dealt with through the Austin office. And your father's water rights, they will be restored. The fraud will be documented and reversed. It will take some legal work, but there are good lawyers in Austin and I know several of them." She nodded. The weight she had been carrying for a year, the weight of the account books and the losses and the slow-building fear for the ranch, was lifting in stages, like fog burning off in the morning. She felt lighter and also strangely bereft, because the weight had been the thing that gave her something urgent to focus on, and without it she was left with only herself and what she felt, standing in the evening light. "You are going back to Austin," she said. Not a question. "When the case is concluded," he said. "Yes." She looked at Clara's ear rather than at him. "I see." A pause. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that I would ask for a reassignment." She looked at him. "The Marshal Service has a permanent posting available in this district," he said, "based out of Redemption Creek. I was considering putting my name in for it." He paused. "If there is reason to." The evening light was very golden and very still, and Louisa Sullivan, who had been invisible in this town for most of her adult life, who had been overlooked by everyone who had ever passed through it, who had learned to be quiet and self-contained and useful and patient and secretly angry and secretly hopeful in equal measure, looked at Ezekiel Hawkins and said, "I think there is reason." He looked at her for a moment with those steady, honest eyes. "I am glad of that," he said. And then, quietly, with a kind of deliberateness that made it mean more, "Because I have been thinking about reason for some weeks now." She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "You are not very romantic for a man making an implication," she said. He smiled, the full, unguarded one. "I can be more direct if you prefer directness." "I prefer it enormously." "Then I will say plainly that I have spent the past 3 weeks watching you do remarkable things without anyone noticing, and I have found that I notice everything, and that it matters to me what happens to you, and that the thought of leaving this county without having said so sits in my chest like something I cannot justify." She was quiet for a moment, because the honesty of it required a moment. Then she said, "I have been falling in love with you since you looked at my account books as though they were genuinely interesting." He laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and real, and it changed the light around them somehow. "That is," he said, "possibly the most specific thing anyone has ever said to me. I told you I preferred directness." He stepped toward her, close enough that she could see the line of the star on his vest and the dust on his coat and the look in his eyes, which was warm and open, and the most direct thing she had ever seen. He said, "May I?" She answered by setting her hand on his chest, feeling the solid, real warmth of him, and he lowered his head and kissed her gently, there in the middle of the main street of Redemption Creek, with the evening light going gold around them and the whole quiet town behind its closed doors, and the sound of the creek somewhere in the distance. It was a good kiss. It was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning and not an end, but a thing that is exactly what it is, true and unhurried and without performance. When he stepped back, his hands were warm on her arms. He said, "I will write to the Marshal Service tonight." "Do that," she said. She rode home in the soft last light of the evening, and she thought about all of it, and somewhere around the 2nd mile she started to smile and could not quite stop. The weeks that followed had their own particular texture, the texture of things settling into new shapes after a long tension has released. The circuit judge arrived on Friday as promised, a sharp-eyed man named Horace Vance who had been on the Texas circuit for 20 years and had seen most varieties of frontier crime. He reviewed the case against Chester Beaumont for 2 days and emerged from the proceedings satisfied. Beaumont was formally charged with livestock theft across county lines, land fraud, bribery of a county official, and assault, and remanded to custody pending trial in Waco. Sheriff Amos Pratt, it emerged, had been accepting payments from Beaumont for 2 years in exchange for keeping the cattle theft investigation slow and shallow. He was charged with corruption and malfeasance and removed from office. The town needed a sheriff, and there was a period of considerable community discussion about this, which Louisa followed from a careful distance and the account books. Ezekiel's request for the permanent posting came back approved from Austin in the second week of May, at which point the town of Redemption Creek had the interesting experience of realizing that the man it had regarded with wariness and some hostility for the past month was now, in fact, its law enforcement officer on a permanent basis. Opinions adjusted themselves with the practical flexibility of people who needed a sheriff and knew it. There was a formal appointment. There was a brief ceremony. There was a badge that was different from the federal deputy badge, a silver sheriff star that the town council presented with a ceremony that was brief and awkward, in the way of people trying to be gracious about something they had not expected to feel gracious about. Ezekiel accepted it with the same quiet, self-possessed dignity he brought to everything. And if anyone in Redemption Creek noted that the new sheriff had particular reason to be seen at the Sullivan Ranch on a regular basis, they noted it privately and with varying degrees of approval, but they did note it, because Louisa Sullivan was beginning, slowly and irrevocably, to be the kind of person people noticed. This did not happen overnight. Visibility, once lost, does not return in a flood. It comes back in increments, in the small moments when someone asks your opinion and waits for the answer, when someone remembers what you said last week and refers back to it, when your presence in a room creates a slight alteration in the atmosphere rather than no alteration at all. Ezekiel created that alteration for her, in ways she had not anticipated. Because when the new sheriff called on Louisa Sullivan, and was seen riding out to the ranch, and was seen walking beside her in the general store, and was seen, on a clear Sunday morning in late May, sitting in the Sullivan family pew at the church with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face like a man who is exactly where he intends to be, people paid attention to that. People who paid attention to where the sheriff was found themselves paying attention to the woman he was with. And Louisa Sullivan, who had been a footnote in her own town for years, became the subject of actual, genuine interest. She found it somewhat overwhelming and mostly gratifying and occasionally irritating, which Ezekiel found amusing in the way he found most things, quietly and genuinely. "You are enjoying this," she told him one evening in late May, sitting on the Sullivan Ranch porch in the warm blue dusk, with her father inside reading and the sound of the crickets starting up across the pasture. "I am enjoying many things," he agreed, with that small private smile. "You know what I mean." "The town is paying attention to you," he said. "This seems to me straightforwardly good. You are worth paying attention to. You have been worth paying attention to since you arrived, and they were not especially interested." He looked at her steadily. "We are talking about different kinds of interest," he said. "The kind of interest this town shows in me is complicated, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What they feel about a black man carrying a sheriff's badge in 1882 is not simple, and it is not always comfortable, and I have known that from the day I rode in." She looked at him. "Does it bother you?" "Some of it bothers me a great deal," he said, with the flat honesty she had come to love in him. "Some of it I have learned to live with. Some of it I intend to change, slowly and by being better at this job than anyone they could have chosen instead." He paused. "I am not naive about what this town is or what some of the people in it believe, but I also know that a man who spends all his time counting enemies does not have enough time to build what matters." She reached over and took his hand, which was resting on the porch rail, and he turned it and held hers, and they sat like that for a while with the evening coming down soft over the Texas hills. "What matters to you?" she asked. "If you are building it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "This, exactly this." She looked at the hills in the fading light and felt the warmth of his hand, and thought that she had spent a very long time being overlooked, and a very long time being patient, and a very long time not saying the things she meant to say, and she was finished with all of that now. "I love you," she said, quiet and plain and without ceremony. He was quiet for a moment that was full rather than empty. "Louisa Sullivan," he said, and the way he said her name made it sound like a thing of weight and significance. "I have loved you since you told me about the moon cycles, in case the record needed to reflect that." She laughed, and it was the best laugh she had laughed in years, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. The summer of 1882 was warm and eventful in Redemption Creek. The case against Chester Beaumont was tried in Waco in July, and the evidence was so thorough and so carefully documented. The account books, the dates, the cross-referenced losses, the forged water rights papers, the testimony of the smaller ranch owners who had been paid to look away and who, facing federal charges of their own, told the whole story, that the trial lasted only 4 days before the verdict came back. Beaumont was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary. The Sullivan water rights were restored in June by order of the circuit court, and the North Creek was again unambiguously theirs. Patrick Sullivan, who had been looking older and more tired for the past year, seemed to regain something in that moment. He was never a demonstrative man, but he sat on the porch the evening after the legal restoration was confirmed and looked out over his land with an expression that Louisa recognized as the closest he came to peace. He called Ezekiel aside that evening, which Louisa noticed but did not intrude upon. She found out what was said in it later from Ezekiel, who told her directly because that was how they operated with each other. "Your father asked me my intentions," he said. They were standing in the kitchen after dinner, doing the ordinary domestic things of clearing the table and washing the dishes, which they did together in the easy way of people who have found their rhythm. "I assumed as much," she said. "What did you say?" "I told him that my intention was to ask you to marry me, and that I wanted his blessing, and that if he gave it I would ask you, and if he did not give it I would ask you anyway, but I would prefer to have it." She set down the dish she was drying, and "he gave it," Ezekiel said, "eventually." After a fairly comprehensive interview about my prospects and my income and my record with the Marshal Service, he paused. "He also said you had been running his ranch for 2 years and that whoever married you had better be ready to keep up." She was smiling. "He said that. He said a great deal more besides. He appears to have had a number of opinions stored up on the subject." She looked at him. "Are you going to ask me?" "I was intending to be more deliberate about it," he said. "I had thought about it, the right moment, the right words." "I do not need the right moment," she said. "I am standing here in the kitchen with a dish towel. Ask me." He set down what he was holding and turned to face her fully. He was not a man who went to one knee dramatically. He stood, as he always stood, with the self-possessed directness that was the truest thing about him, and he said, "Louisa Sullivan, I want to spend my life with you. I want to be your partner in every sense of the word. I want to sit on your porch and ride your fence lines and argue with your account books and listen to you tell me what everyone else has missed. I am asking you to marry me." She set down the dish towel. "Yes," she said. "Of course yes, obviously yes." He laughed, and she crossed the kitchen to him, and he pulled her close and held her in the warm kitchen light, and she pressed her face into the solid warmth of his shoulder, and felt the specific joy of a woman who has been invisible for years and has finally, irrevocably, been found by the one person who was paying attention. They were married in August. The wedding was at the Sullivan Ranch, because the church remained a complicated space in Redemption Creek, and because Louisa had never been especially interested in performing her life for an audience, and because the ranch was the truest expression of who she was and what mattered to her, and she wanted to marry Ezekiel Hawkins at the place where all of that was real. The pastor came out from town. A few of the hands who had been with the Sullivan Ranch for years attended, their boots polished and their hats held respectfully. Mrs. Aldrich from the dry goods store came, having apparently decided that the new sheriff's wife was someone worth knowing. 2 families from neighboring ranches came. people who had been among the victims of Beaumont's theft ring, and who regarded both Louisa and Ezekiel with the particular gratitude of people whose livelihoods had been restored. Patrick Sullivan walked his daughter to the spot under the old oak tree beside the house, where Ezekiel was standing in his best coat with the sheriff's badge on his chest, and a look on his face that Louisa thought she would remember for the rest of her life. The look of a man standing at the exact intersection of where he had been and where he was going, fully present and fully certain. The vows were simple. They were not people who needed many words. They needed the right ones. After the ceremony there was food and music, a fiddle player from one of the neighboring ranches, and the particular warmth of a summer evening in the Texas Hill Country, and Louisa Sullivan became Louisa Hawkins under a sky that was going orange and purple at the edges, and the whole thing felt to her like something she had not known she was waiting for until she arrived at it. Her father shook Ezekiel's hand with both of his, which was the most demonstrative thing she had seen him do in a decade. That evening, sitting on the porch while the last guests were making their way home, Ezekiel said, "Are you happy?" "Profoundly," she said. "Are you?" "More than I know what to do with," he said. "But I am figuring it out." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the summer dark settled over the ranch, and the creek ran somewhere in the distance, and the world was, for this moment, exactly right. The fall of 1882 brought the harvest and the quiet rhythms of a ranch and a marriage finding its shape. Louisa continued to manage the Sullivan Ranch books, which was now the family business in which she and Ezekiel both had a stake, and Ezekiel ran the town with the steady, precise hand of a man who was building trust through consistent action. The town of Redemption Creek adjusted. Not all at once. Not without friction. There were men who regarded the black sheriff with open hostility, and Ezekiel dealt with them with the flat, immovable patience of someone who had been dealing with that variety of hostility for his entire life, and had no intention of making it worse, but also no intention of making himself smaller. There were incidents, unpleasant ones, that Louisa heard about and seethed over with a fury that was partly the fury of a person who has known injustice herself in her own small way, and partly the much larger fury of a wife watching her husband be treated as less than he was. They talked about it, the way they talked about everything, openly and without prettifying it. "You are angrier about it than I am," he observed one evening not unkindly. "Should I not be?" "You should be whatever you are," he said. "I am simply observing." "I know what it is to be invisible," she said, "to be treated as though you do not merit the same consideration as everyone else. I know what it costs, and what you carry is so much larger than what I have ever been asked to carry, and when I see it I feel," she paused, searching for the right word, "incandescent." He looked at her and there was something in his face that was very warm and very deep. "I know," he said, "I know you do." "It is not enough," she said, "being angry." "No," he agreed, "but it is true. And true things have their own kind of value." She pressed her lips together. "I will find other ways to be useful." He almost smiled. "You always do." And she did. She began, quietly and practically, to apply the same methodical attention to the social machinery of Redemption Creek that she had applied to the account books. She documented which business owners were fair and which were not. She directed the Sullivan Ranch's considerable commerce to the businesses that treated people decently. She made it quietly understood, through the indirect channels that women in small towns have always used, that the new sheriff's wife had opinions and that her opinions were connected to her spending habits. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was effective in the way that consistent, patient pressure is always effective. Ezekiel found out about it in November when two separate businessmen in town mentioned, puzzled but cooperative, that they had found themselves reconsidering certain of their policies. "You are doing it again," he said when they were home that evening. "Doing what?" "The thing where you change the landscape without anyone seeing you do it." She smiled. "Is it working?" "Apparently." He shook his head, but he was smiling too. "You are formidable, Louisa Hawkins." "I know," she said pleasantly. By winter, she knew she was expecting a child. She told him on a cold December evening with the fire burning high and the wind coming off the hills and the whole ranch quiet around them. He went still in the way he went still when something mattered very much, completely and deliberately still, and then his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, something that was pure undefended joy. "When?" he asked. "June, if I have counted right." He got up from the chair where he had been sitting and crossed the room and took both her hands and looked at her with that wide-open joy still on his face. And she thought that in all the time she had spent being invisible, she had never imagined arriving at a moment like this, in a marriage like this, feeling exactly like this. "I am going to be a terrible worrier," he said. "I know," she said. "You are already planning things, I can tell." "I have been planning things since October," he admitted. "Just in case." She laughed. "You are ridiculous." "I am thorough," he said. "There is a difference." She stood up and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, solid and warm and present. And outside the wind moved through the cedars and the fire crackled, and the world contracted to the size of this room and this warmth and this certainty. The winter was long but good. Patrick Sullivan's health improved marginally with rest, and the herbal remedies that Louisa researched in her methodical way. And he spent the cold months teaching Ezekiel things about the land that only a man who had worked it for 30 years could know. The seasonal patterns of the water, the best pastures for each kind of weather, the particular temperament of the east fence line. It was a slow, quiet transference of knowledge between two men who respected each other, and Louisa watched it happen with a feeling she could not entirely name. Her father was, in his careful and unexpressive way, happy. He had worried about the ranch and the future of it, which he had confessed to Louisa once in a rare moment of openness. He had not, she gathered, wanted to leave it to the mercy of a cattle market and no one at the helm who cared. Now there was someone. Two someones, one of whom was his daughter, who had been caring all along and was finally, visibly, undeniably at the center of the thing she had always run from the margins. Spring came again to Redemption Creek, and with it the news of Beaumont's appeals being denied in Waco, which settled the last of the legal anxiety definitively. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. The ranch was safe. In early April, a letter arrived from Austin signed by the senior U.S. Marshal of the district, formally commending Ezekiel Hawkins for the Beaumont investigation and the restoration of the Sullivan land rights, and noting that his work in the district had been exemplary. It was a form letter in its bones, but the specific commendations in it were not generic. Someone in Austin had actually read the case file and understood what had been done and how difficult it had been, and had written the letter accordingly. Louisa read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and her hands pressed flat over the small but now unmistakable rounding of her middle, and she felt something settle in her that had been moving for a long time. A final piece, dropping into place. Ezekiel came in from the morning rounds, dusty and carrying his hat, and looked at the letter in her hands. "Good news," he said. "Come and read it," she said. He came and stood behind her and read it over her shoulder, and she felt him go still in that particular way, and then his hand settled warm on her shoulder. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He kissed the top of her head, which was a small and ordinary thing and completely wonderful. Their son was born in June, on a warm Tuesday morning with the smell of cedar coming through the open window and the ranch hands already at work in the far pastures. He was a solid, healthy boy who announced himself to the world with considerable enthusiasm, and then settled into his father's arms with what appeared to be profound satisfaction. They named him Patrick Ezekiel Hawkins, after the man who had built this land and the man who would now help to keep it. Patrick Sullivan, who had not wept at his wife's funeral or his son's, who had ridden through drought and loss and fraud without showing much of what was underneath, held his grandson for the first time with an expression on his face that Louisa had not seen since she was very small, something open and unhidden and unbearably tender. "He has your eyes," Ezekiel said to Louisa. "He has your ears," she said. "Those are good ears." "They are satisfactory ears," she said, and he laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled again, and the room was full of a kind of warmth that Louisa thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly describe and never quite managing. The months after Patrick's birth were the fullest and most complicated and most joyful that Louisa could remember. Running a ranch with a newborn and a husband who was the county sheriff and a father who needed occasional care was not a small undertaking. There were days when she was exhausted in ways that went all the way to the bone, when the account books blurred and the baby was restless, and the weather was wrong and everything seemed to require more of her than she had available. On those days, Ezekiel would come home in the evening and take the baby without being asked and walk him quiet until he settled, and would heat the coffee and set it beside her and sit across the table from her and say, "What do you need?" And she would tell him, and he would either do it or help her figure out how to do it, and they would manage, the way people who are actually partners manage, because the load is shared and the sharing of it is itself a form of sustenance. She loved him for the grand things, the courage and the honesty and the quiet fearlessness. She loved him for the small things just as much. The way he took the baby at 3 in the morning without complaint. The way he read the ranch account books and asked intelligent questions. The way he argued with her about cattle prices and water schedules and let her be right when she was right, which was often. The way he said her name. She had spent years being unnamed in her own town. He said her name like it was worth saying, like she was worth saying. Redemption Creek changed slowly, as small towns change, under the slow pressure of consistent decent behavior. Ezekiel's tenure as sheriff, now going on 2 years, had produced a community that was mostly law-abiding and occasionally grudgingly respectful, and sometimes genuinely grateful. There were still people who would never be fully comfortable with him, and he knew it and she knew it, and they both operated with clear eyes about what was changeable and what was not. But the balance of the town, its essential character, was shifting. New families came, as they always did in this era, drawn west by land and opportunity. Several of them were families of color, freedmen who had been moving into Texas since the end of the war, and were looking for a place to put down roots. Ezekiel dealt with the threats and hostility that accompanied their arrival with the same flat, precise, implacable enforcement of the law that he applied to everything else. You could be as hostile as you liked in your heart, in Redemption Creek in 1884. What you could not do was act on it. The sheriff would see to that. Louisa worked alongside him in this, in her particular way. She opened the general store account of the Sullivan Ranch to the new families, extending credit on the same terms as anyone else, which was both a commercial and a social statement in a small town where commerce and social standing were tightly braided. She invited 2 of the new wives to the informal women's gathering she had begun hosting on Thursday afternoons, which was ostensibly for sewing and was actually for information exchange and community building, and which had become quietly essential in the way that women's organizations in small towns always become essential. She realized gradually, no longer invisible. Not in Redemption Creek, not to anyone. She was not sure exactly when the change had completed itself. It had not been dramatic. It had not been a single moment. It had been the accumulated weight of being genuinely seen by one person, who was the right person, and of that visibility radiating outward in ways she had not planned or expected. She was Louisa Hawkins now, wife of the sheriff, daughter of the biggest rancher in the county, mother of young Patrick, manager of the Sullivan Ranch books and now a growing collection of other books for neighboring families, who had discovered that she had a talent for numbers and a talent for discretion. She was the woman who hosted Thursday afternoons and who had a direct line to the county land office after the fraud case had cleaned it out and replaced it with people who answered their correspondence. She was seen. It was, she thought one afternoon in the late summer of 1884, not an entirely comfortable feeling. Being seen meant being subject to judgment and expectation, and the constant negotiation of other people's opinions. She sometimes missed the strange freedom of invisibility, the ability to move through a room unnoticed and observe everything. And then Ezekiel came home in the late afternoon with the baby on his hip, having collected him from her father's house, where he had been spending the afternoon, and their son was babbling something that was probably supposed to be Papa, and Ezekiel was saying, almost, in the patient, amused voice he used for coaching the baby's vocabulary. And the whole thing was so ordinary and so completely hers that she stopped missing anything at all. Her father, who was 70 now and moving more slowly, watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has worried about the future of his life's work and has seen it land in good hands. He was not well. He knew it and Louisa knew it, and they did not talk about it with any false comfort. What they talked about, on the evenings when she came to sit with him on the porch, was the ranch and the land and the way the creek ran in different seasons and the particular smell of the cedar after rain. He told her things he had never told her before, about her mother and the early days of the ranch and the choices he had made, and the things he wished he had done differently. She listened and she remembered, and she wrote none of it down, because some things need to be held rather than recorded. He told her once on a clear October evening with the late light going golden across the pastures that she had always been stronger than he knew how to say. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You showed me how to love this land. That was not nothing." He looked at the land and he nodded, and they sat together in the way that people sit when words have done enough. Patrick Sullivan died in November of 1884, quietly in the house he had built. Louisa was with him. Ezekiel was in the next room. The hands were in the yard. The ranch went on around him as it always had, which was, she thought, exactly as he would have wanted it. The grief was real and it was deep, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was. Ezekiel held her through the first bad nights and brought her coffee in the mornings and let her be sad without trying to fix it, and she loved him for that with a specific and inexpressible gratitude. The ranch passed formally to her in the will, as she had always expected it to. The legal documentation was clear and solid, the work of a good Austin lawyer who had come recommended by the same firm that had handled the water rights restoration. There was no dispute. The Sullivan Ranch became the Hawkins Ranch in name, though Louisa kept the Sullivan in the deed as a testament, because names matter and the people behind them matter, and she was not going to let her father's work become anonymous. The Sullivan Hawkins Ranch. The clerk in the county office wrote it down without blinking, which she noted with private satisfaction. Spring came back. It always came back. Young Patrick Hawkins, who was nearly 3 now and had strong opinions about horses and mud and the particular cats who lived in the barn, was the center of a great deal of attention and love. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's broad shoulders and an absolutely intractable temperament that appeared to have come from both of them equally. In the spring of 1885, Louisa told Ezekiel she was expecting again. He responded the same way he had the first time, with the complete stillness and then the undefended joy, and then he said, "I want a daughter." "You cannot order them," she said. "I am aware of how it works," he said with great dignity. "I am expressing a preference." "Noted," she said. "No promises." Their second child was a boy, born in October of 1885, whom they named Joseph. He was quieter than his brother from the start, with large dark eyes and a thoughtful disposition that made Ezekiel say, "He takes after you," and made Louisa say, "I certainly hope so." The ranch expanded cautiously and carefully, the way that Louisa expanded all things. She bought the adjacent property when the owner moved north, negotiated the price herself, and integrated the land into the operation with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The herd grew. The accounts improved. The books, which she could now read in her sleep, began to tell a different story than the anxious story they had told in the dark years before Ezekiel arrived. Redemption Creek was not a perfect place. She did not expect it to be. It was a small Texas town in the 1880s, which meant it carried all the weight of that time and that place, the prejudice and the violence and the injustice that were woven into the structure of the world. She and Ezekiel could not unmake that world. What they could do was live well within it and push steadily at its edges and raise their children to be the kind of people who pushed too. They talked about this on evenings when the ranch was quiet and the boys were asleep and the fire was low. They talked about what they wanted for Patrick and Joseph, what they wanted to give them that neither of them had been given easily. Ezekiel had lived most of his life being told in various ways that he was worth less than other men, and he had spent that life refusing the premise. Louisa had lived most of hers being told in various ways that she was worth less than other women, and she had spent it in the same refusal, quieter but just as absolute. They were going to raise boys who did not need to refuse anything. They were going to raise boys who simply knew their worth as a given fact, the way you know the sun rises. In the winter of 1886, a letter arrived from Washington. It was addressed to Ezekiel and bore the seal of the federal government, and Louisa set it on the table when it came and looked at it with the particular feeling of a woman who trusts her husband completely and is still slightly afraid of sealed letters from Washington. He opened it at the kitchen table with both boys occupied on the floor around them, Patrick with a set of wooden blocks and Joseph with the serious business of chewing on a rag. He read it once and then read it again. "They are offering me a posting in the U.S. Marshal Service," he said. "Senior deputy, based in Austin." She was quiet. "It would mean leaving Redemption Creek," he said. He looked up at her. "The sheriff's post would go to someone else." She looked at the letter and then at the boys and then at him. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked first." He folded the letter carefully. "I want to stay," he said. "I am building something here. We are building something here. Austin is a city, and there are things the Marshal Service could offer me there that I cannot have in a small county position. But this is ours. This town is changing, slowly, partly because of what we have done here. I do not want to hand it to someone else who may not care about those changes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then write them a kind refusal," she said. He smiled. "That was quick." "You told me what you wanted," she said. "You want to stay, we stay." "It was a considerable opportunity," he said. "There will be others," she said, "and we have everything that matters here." He looked at her and the kitchen was warm and Patrick knocked over his tower of blocks and wailed briefly and was immediately distracted by his own ability to rebuild it, and Joseph continued his assessment of the rag with solemn commitment. "We do," Ezekiel said. "We have everything." He declined the Austin posting. He wrote the letter himself, courteous and unequivocal, and sent it on the morning stage. Louisa watched him do it from the kitchen window and felt the specific peace of a woman who has chosen her life deliberately and loves it completely. That spring, a girl was born to them. She came early one March morning, quick and fierce and already opinionated about everything, and when Ezekiel held her for the first time he looked at Louisa with an expression that was almost comical in its transparency. "You were right," Louisa said. "You wanted one." "She is extraordinary," he said in a slightly dazed voice. "She is 12 minutes old. Already extraordinary." They named her Margaret Catherine Hawkins, after Louisa's mother and his grandmother. She grew up to be a person who did not know what invisibility was, because she had never been taught it, and because the world she was growing up in was, by small and consistent and stubborn increments, learning to do better. The years went on in the way that years go when the life is good, full and layered and quiet in the essential places where quiet matters. The ranch flourished. Redemption Creek continued its slow evolution. The three children, Patrick and Joseph and Margaret, grew up on the land with the full knowledge of where they came from, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. Ezekiel Hawkins served as sheriff of Redemption Creek for 14 years in the end, and in that time built a record of service that was careful and fair and quietly remarkable. The record of a man who had understood from the beginning that law enforcement was most powerful not as a display of authority, but as a service to the community it represented. The community learned, over time and imperfectly but genuinely, to receive it as such. Louisa Hawkins managed the Sullivan Hawkins Ranch and her small but growing bookkeeping business and the Thursday afternoon gathering, and a dozen other threads of community life with the same patient, methodical, invisible no longer capability that she had always had. She was known in Redemption Creek and in the county and eventually in the wider district as someone worth consulting, someone whose opinion had weight, someone who noticed things. She had always noticed things. The difference was that now people knew it. On an evening in the fall of 1895, when the boys were in their teens and Margaret was 8 and the ranch was running well, and the accounts were solid, and the Texas Hill country was going gold and amber around the edges with the autumn, Louisa and Ezekiel sat on the porch of the house that had been built by her father and added to by both of them over the years, and the sound of the children inside was a warm, distant music. He had gone a little gray at the temples, which she found, to his private amusement, deeply distinguished. She had more lines around her eyes, which she did not mind, because they were the lines of a life she had chosen and lived fully. "We have done well," she said. "We have," he agreed. She looked at the land rolling away into the dusk, the pastures and the creek and the cedar hills beyond, all of it hers and his and theirs and their children's after them. "I used to think," she said, "that being invisible was something I had to accept, that it was the shape of my life and I should make the best of it. And now I know it was not," she said. "I was never invisible, I was simply not yet found," she looked at him, "by the right person." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand for 13 years, easy and certain. "I was paying attention," he said. "You were," she said. "You were the only one." "And it is very fortunate," he said, "that I was paying enough for both of us." She laughed and he smiled, and the evening settled around them like a hand laid gently over everything, warm and full and complete. Inside, Margaret was arguing with Patrick about something involving the dog, and Joseph's voice was the low, peacemaking rumble that he had always been the best of the three at, and the fire was burning in the hearth and the stars were coming out over the Texas hills, one by one, certain and unhurried. Louisa Hawkins sat on the porch of her home, her hand in her husband's hand, and felt the extraordinary, ordinary completeness of a life that had been waiting for her all along. She had been overlooked for years. She had been invisible. She had been the footnote, the background, the woman behind the accounts and the management and the quiet work that everyone needed and no one saw. And then a man had ridden into Redemption Creek on a bay gelding with a federal badge on his vest and had looked at her, really looked at her, with the kind of attention that does not look away, and everything had changed. Not because she had changed. She had always been exactly who she was. But because being seen by the right person, one honest and steadfast and paying attention person, had made it possible for her to stop making herself smaller and start taking up exactly the space she had always deserved. The stars came out over Redemption Creek, one after another, steady and sure. Ezekiel and Louisa sat in the quiet and the dark and the warmth and did not need to say anything, because some things are past the need for words. Some things are simply true, the way the land is true, the way the water runs, the way the cedar smells after rain. They had built something real. They had built it carefully and together, and it was theirs, this life, this land, this family, this quiet evening at the end of a day in the middle of a long, good life. It was everything. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was home.